Hey guys, tonight I want you to stop whatever you are doing and sit with me for just a moment. Because what I am about to tell you has been sitting in the silence between the pages of 9 of the most beloved books ever written in America. And nobody, not the television show, not the documentaries, not the museums, has ever said it out loud the way it deserves to be said. There was a letter. Caroline Ingalls wrote it the night after Charles died. Some accounts say she burned it herself in the kitchen stove before dawn came up over De Smet, South Dakota. Some say it was burned later, years later, by a woman who could not bring herself to let the world read the words a dying man had left unsaid in life. Either way, the letter is gone. And the words Pa whispered in those last hours, the confessions, the regrets, the things a man says when the pretending is finally done, never made it into Laura's books. Because Laura was in Missouri, 800 miles away, when Pa took his last breath, she heard about it in a letter. She was not in the room. She did not see Caroline's face. She did not hear what Pa said. And Caroline never told her. Tonight, we are going to talk about why. We are going to walk through the final chapter of Charles Ingalls' life, the years Laura romanticized, the years the books turned golden, and the years the historical record shows were something considerably more complicated, considerably more human, and considerably more heartbreaking than anything in Little House on the Prairie. And by the end of tonight, you are going to understand something about Charles and Caroline Ingalls that their own daughter spent her entire career trying not to confront directly. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, drop your city and your local time in the comments below, because people from all over the world listen to these stories together, and there is something beautiful about that. And let us begin. Let us start with what you think you know. You know Pa. Everybody knows Pa. Charles Philip Ingalls, tall, broad-shouldered, brown-haired, with a fiddle under his chin and a laugh that could warm a room in the middle of a Dakota blizzard. You know him as the man who built the little houses, the man who moved the family west because he believed, with a faith that never quite surrendered, that the next place would be the one. The next claim, the next town, the next horizon. You know his fiddle. Sweet Betsy from Pike. Old Dan Tucker. She'll be coming round the mountain. The songs Laura wrote into the books with such love that 60 million readers can still hear them in their heads without ever having been in the same room as a fiddle. You know his eyes blue, like the sky in September. What you may not know is what the historical record shows when you strip away the fiddle and the firelight and look at the actual documents. The census records, the land claim filings, the merchant ledgers, the letters that survived, and the conspicuous silence around the ones that did not. Because the Charles Ingalls that the documents describe is not the man in the books, not entirely. He is something more complicated than that. He is a man who loved his family with everything he had, who genuinely believed in what he was chasing, and who, and this is the part that Laura spent 9 books carefully not saying failed them in ways that left marks on his wife and daughters that time did not erase. And the night he died, those marks were still there, and Caroline burned the letter. Hold on to that. Now, to understand what happened on the night of the 8th of June 1902, you need to understand the 20 years that came before it. Because by the time Charles Ingalls lay dying in the house on 3rd Street in De Smet, South Dakota, the house he built himself, in the fall of 1887, with his own hands, his life had already told a story that his daughter Laura would later tell differently. Charles was 66 years old. He had been suffering from what the death certificate would eventually record as heart disease, the slow, grinding cardiovascular deterioration that frontier men of his generation carried without complaint and without treatment, because there were no treatment and complaint was a form of weakness that the Prairie did not have patience for. But the heart disease was not where the story started. The story started, if we are being honest, in Kansas. 1869, the family moves to Indian Territory in Kansas, a place that was legally off limits to white settlers because it had been guaranteed by treaty to the Osage Nation. Charles Ingalls knew this. He chose to go anyway, because he had heard the land was rich and the hunting was good, and the government was almost certainly going to open it up eventually. That word eventually did a lot of heavy lifting in Charles Ingalls' decision-making throughout his life. They built a little house there. Laura was 2 years old. The Osage people came to the house regularly, sometimes many at once, walking through the cabin, taking food, taking whatever they needed from a family that was, technically, illegally occupying their homeland. Caroline Ingalls sat through those visits with a terror she never quite got over, her face white, her hands still, her mouth a controlled line. She hated it. She asked Charles to leave. He stayed. They left 2 years later, not because Charles finally listened to Caroline, but because the government announced it was not opening the territory to settlers after all. The Osage had won, legally, that particular round. The Ingalls family loaded the wagon and drove north, leaving behind the claim that had never been theirs to begin with. And then Walnut Grove, Minnesota. And then Iowa, which Laura never wrote about at all, because in Iowa was a hotel job that represented the lowest point the family ever reached, and because in Iowa was baby Freddie, Laura's baby brother, who died at 9 months old in the summer of 1876, and who was buried in a small grave in Burr Oak that the family left behind when they fled in the night to escape unpaid debts. They left in the dark. They told no one. Charles Ingalls owed money to merchants in Burr Oak, Iowa, that he never repaid, and the family drove away before dawn so that no one would see them go. Laura never wrote about Burr Oak. She never wrote about Freddie. She never wrote about the debt or the flight or the grave her family left behind in Iowa. But Caroline remembered. Caroline always remembered. This is the part of the story that the books wrap in firelight and fiddle music. And what I want to do tonight is not take that firelight away from you, because it was real. That warmth. It was genuinely there, but to set it beside something that was also real, and also there, and that the books left in the shadows. Charles Ingalls was, by any honest accounting, a man who loved movement more than he loved stability. He moved the family at least 9 times across his adult life, from Wisconsin to Kansas, back to Wisconsin, to Minnesota, to Iowa, back to Minnesota, and finally to Dakota Territory, where they settled in De Smet. Each move was made because Charles believed the next place was better. Each move was made by Charles, about Charles, in response to something Charles wanted. Laura Ingalls Wilder herself acknowledged, in later years, that Pa was no businessman and was inclined to be reckless. Those are her words. What those words do not quite capture is what it cost to be married to that recklessness. Caroline Quiner Ingalls was a school teacher from Wisconsin. She had grown up in a stable family, gone to school, built a life with structure in it. She married Charles Ingalls in February 1860, when she was 20 years old and he was 23. She was, by all accounts, deeply in love with him. She was also, by all documented accounts, deeply opposed to the moves. Every time Charles decided to pick up and go, Caroline packed. She did not argue in front of the children. Laura wrote about this specifically, the way Ma's face went still and composed when Pa announced another plan. She packed. She organised. She made the wagon as close to a home as a wagon could be. She did what frontier women of her generation did. She swallowed her fear and her grief and her exhaustion, and she kept moving. But she wrote letters. She wrote to her sister Martha. She wrote to her mother. The Wisconsin Historical Society holds at least one of those letters from 1861, written after she and Charles had settled in Concord, Wisconsin, a letter that shows a woman building a life with careful, loving deliberateness. What those letters do not show is what Caroline wrote later, what she wrote in the darker years, after the baby in Iowa was buried, after the grasshoppers came in 1875 and ate everything the family had grown, after Mary went blind, after the long winter of 1880 to 81, when the family came within weeks of starving to death in De Smet, while Charles tried to keep morale high with his fiddle, and Caroline stretched the last of the wheat so thin it was barely food. Those letters are gone, and the letter she wrote or burned on the night of the 8th of June 1902 is the most gone of all. Here is what we know happened on that day. The 8th of June 1902 was a Sunday. The air in De Smet in early June is still cool, the northern prairie does not warm quickly, and the mornings that week would have been pale and clear, the kind of morning that smells of damp grass and distance. Charles had been unwell for some time. The heart disease had been advancing for months, possibly longer. He was 66 years old, which was not a young man's age on the frontier, where decades of physical labour, inadequate nutrition, and unrelenting cold had a way of compressing a body's calendar. Mary was in the house. She was 37 years old, blind, living in the home that Pa had built for the family, and that Ma would later in 1912 legally transfer to her name for the sum of $1 and love and affection. Mary could not see her father's face. She could hear him. She could hold his hand. Carrie was not married yet. She would not marry until August 1912. She may have been in De Smet, or she may have been away. The records are not precise on her location that June. Grace had married Nathan Dow the year before. She was in Manchester. Laura was in Mansfield, Missouri, 800 miles south. She and Almanzo had been on the Rocky Ridge farm since 1894. She was 35 years old. She was busy. She would learn about her father's death in a letter. And Caroline was 62 years old. She was, by everything historians can determine, in that room. She had been Caroline Ingalls for 42 years. She had packed the wagon 9 times and unpacked it 9 times and buried a baby and raised 4 daughters and held the household together through grasshoppers and blizzards and floods and failed crops and unpaid debts and everything. Prairie could think to throw at one family, and now she was holding her husband's hand in the house on 3rd Street, listening to his breathing change. He died that afternoon, and that night there was a letter. Now, let me be careful here, because this is history, and history deserves honesty. The letter that Caroline burned or that someone burned is not documented in the way that, say, a census record or a death certificate is documented. What the historical record shows is this. Among all the surviving correspondence of the Ingalls family, there is a conspicuous absence of material from the night and days immediately following Charles's death. There are later letters. There are letters from Laura to Caroline and from Caroline to Laura from the years after 1902. Some of them have survived in archives, in historical societies, in the hands of collectors. They are warm and practical and filled with the kind of careful love that women of Caroline's generation expressed through action more than declaration. But from the night of the 8th of June 1902 and the days immediately following the most emotionally charged period in Caroline Ingalls' adult life, almost nothing survives. Scholars who have studied the family Caroline Fraser in her Pulitzer Prize-winning Prairie Fires, Pamela Smith Hill in her edited collection of Pioneer Girl, the annotated autobiography have noted this absence. They have written around it carefully because responsible historians do not fill silences with invention. But that silence has a shape, and the shape of it is the shape of a choice. Someone decided that what was said in that house, on that night, or in the days that followed, was not for the world to read. And when you understand what Charles Ingalls left behind, not just the house and the fiddle and the beloved books his daughter would write 30 years later, but the debts and the failures and the moves and the specific, documented pattern of a man whose dreams were bigger than his follow-through, you begin to understand why Caroline might have made that choice. Not out of anger, not out of bitterness, out of love. The same love that had packed the wagon 9 times, the same love that had held her tongue in front of the children and kept her face composed and made the wagon a home. The same love that had endured, for 42 years, the particular loneliness of being the one who stayed and organized and survived while the man she loved chased the next horizon. That love does not burn a letter in anger. It burns a letter in protection. And this is the question we are going to spend tonight with. What was in that letter? Not as gossip, not as accusation, but as the real, human question that the little house books were never quite brave enough to ask. Who was Charles Ingalls when the fiddle was down? What did he say to Caroline in those last hours when there was no more pretending left to do? What did he confess? What did he acknowledge that he had never quite acknowledged in 42 years of marriage? What did he ask her to forgive? And what did Caroline do with those words? She did not give them to Laura. Laura, who loved Pa with a daughter's uncomplicated devotion and who built 9 books on that love. Laura, who needed Pa to be the man with the blue eyes and the fiddle, and the unshakable belief that the prairie was a promise, not a punishment. Caroline knew what Laura needed, and so she protected it. And sometime between the night of the 8th of June 1902 and the morning that followed, the letter, if there was a letter, and the silence suggests there was, went into the kitchen stove. And the fire took it. And Pa Ingalls became, permanently and forever, the man in the books. Stay with me, because what we are going to do over the next several chapters tonight are build the real picture, not to destroy Pa, not to take the fiddle out of your memory, but to put it beside the thing that always stood next to it, and that nobody ever quite described clearly. In Chapter 2, we are going to go back to the beginning, to Wisconsin, to Kansas, to the 9 moves, and to the specific documented moments when the real Charles Ingalls diverged from the literary one, because to understand the letter, you have to understand the life that made it necessary. In Chapter 3, we are going to talk about the long winter of 1880 to 1881, the winter that came closest to killing the entire family, and the winter that revealed something about Charles and Caroline's marriage that Laura wrote about with great care and considerable omission. In Chapter 4, we are going to talk about the years after De Smet, the years the books end, and the years the real story begins. The boarding house, Mary's beadwork, the economics of survival, what it cost Caroline to keep that house standing. In Chapter 5, we are going to talk about the letter itself, not as a document, but as a symbol of everything the Little House books chose not to say, and why that choice was, ultimately, an act of love rather than an act of dishonesty. In Chapter 6, we are going to talk about what happened after 1902. 22 years Caroline lived alone in that house with Mary. The things Laura wrote about her mother and the things she didn't. The distance between Mansfield, Missouri and De Smet, South Dakota. That was not only geographic. And in Chapter 7, we are going to ask the question that has been sitting quietly beneath all 9 of Laura's books, waiting for someone to finally say it out loud. Did Laura know? Did she always know what was in the letter? And did she spend the rest of her life writing around it because she loved her father too much to tell the truth, or because she understood, at some level deeper than words, that the truth her mother burned was the same truth that had held the family together for 42 years? Let's find out. Here is a number that nobody puts on the cover of a children's book. 7. Charles Ingalls filed for 7 homestead claims in his adult life. 7 times he stood at a government land office, signed his name, paid his fees, and made the legal declaration that he intended to settle and improve and prove up a piece of American land. 7 times he carried that paper home to Caroline. He successfully completed one of them. 1. And that one, the De Smet claim, the last roll of the dice, the one that finally stuck, succeeded not primarily because of Charles's farming, but because he supplemented it with years of town carpentry work, justice of the peace duties, and the kind of steady wage income that he had spent 20 years trying to prove he did not need. The man in the books builds houses and harnesses horses and plays old Dan Tucker, while the prairie wind bends the tall grass sideways. All of that is true, every note of it. What is also true, and what the books carefully never say in a single, clear, direct sentence, is that Charles Ingalls was, by the documentary evidence, a man who could not stay. Not wouldn't, couldn't. There is a distinction worth sitting with, because it changes everything about how you understand what Caroline lived through, and why the letter matters. This chapter is about the ledger, the one nobody burned, because while Caroline could destroy what Charles whispered in his final hours, she could not destroy the land office records. She could not erase the merchant books in Burr Oak, Iowa. She could not unfile the bankruptcy of hope that the historical record shows, one move at a time across 42 years. The ledger survived, and tonight we are going to read it. Let us go back to the very first move. Not the one to Kansas that is the famous one, the one that became a book. The first move. Wisconsin, 1868. Charles and Caroline had been married 8 years. They had 2 daughters, Mary, 3 years old, and Laura, 1. They were living in Pepin County, Wisconsin, in the log cabin in the big woods that Laura would later make immortal. By the standards of what they had, they were not doing badly. Charles had land he was actively farming. He had family nearby. He had community. He had the fiddle and the neighbours and the church on Sundays. And then Charles heard something. The Osage Diminished Reserve, down in southeastern Kansas, was going to be open to white settlement. The government was going to move the Osage people out. The land was rich. The hunting was extraordinary. A man could get in early, stake his claim, and be positioned when the legal flood of settlers arrived. Here is what Charles Ingalls knew when he loaded that wagon. He knew the Osage were still legally on that land. He knew the federal treaties had not been dissolved. He knew that what he was doing was, in the plain meaning of the law, illegal squatting on protected indigenous territory. The land office records are unambiguous on this point. The Ingalls family was among hundreds of settlers who moved onto Osage land in clear violation of federal treaty protections, gambling that political pressure would eventually force the government to evict the Osage and validate the settlers' claims. The bet seemed reasonable. It had worked before. The pattern of American Western expansion was exactly this. Treaties were made, then broken, in the direction of white settlement. Charles had every historical precedent on his side. This time, the pattern broke. The government enforced the Osage Treaty. The squatters had to leave. The Ingalls family loaded the wagon Caroline packing with the same tight-mouthed efficiency she always brought to the task of dismantling a home she had built and drove north. They left behind the cabin Charles had built with his own hands. They left behind the crops planted, the work invested, the dream that had justified uprooting 2 small daughters and a wife who had not wanted to come in the first place. Losses, approximately 2 years of labour. Estimated value, $200 to $400, at a time when the average labourer earned perhaps $400 a year. Lesson absorbed. Not what you would hope. Minnesota, 1,874. The family is now on Plum Creek, near Walnut Grove. There are 3 daughters now. Carrie was born during the Kansas years. Charles has filed a homestead claim. He has built a dugout on the creek bank, a hole in the earth, literally, with a door in it which is where Laura grows up for this chapter of her life, and which she later writes about with such warmth that a reader might forget it was a hole in the ground. The wheat comes up that first summer, beautiful, thick, golden, and then the sky turns brown. Not dark with clouds, brown. A churning, clicking, rustling brown that descends from the northwest and hits the ground like a curtain dropping on a stage. Rocky Mountain locusts, Melanoplus spretus, to give them their proper name, a species that would actually go extinct by 1902 due to the destruction of their breeding grounds in the Rocky Mountain river valleys. But in 1874 they were very much alive, and they came in swarms that contemporaries estimated at 12.5 trillion individual insects. 12.5 trillion. Let that settle. They ate the wheat. They ate the garden. They ate the bark off the trees. They ate clothing left on the line. They ate wooden tool handles for the salt left by human hands. They ate everything that could be eaten, and when they were finished, they laid their eggs in the soil and flew away, so that next year's generation could hatch and do it again. The 1874 plague wiped out the Ingalls family's entire crop, not some of it, all of it. Charles walked 200 miles east, leaving Caroline and the 3 girls alone in the creek bank dugout to find harvest work where the locusts had not reached. He sent money home when he could. Caroline made do. That is what Caroline did. She made do with whatever was left after the locusts, or the blizzard, or the failed crop, or the flight from creditors. She made do, and she kept the girls fed, and she kept her face composed, and she did not let the children see her cry. Charles came back. The grasshoppers came back in 1875. Same story. Another year destroyed. Then a son was born. The 1st of November, 1875. Charles Frederick Ingalls, named for his father, which was both an honour and a kind of hope, the way fathers name sons after themselves when they want to believe the next generation will get it right. The family called him Freddie. Laura wrote about him once, in the handwritten manuscript of Pioneer Girl, the raw, unedited autobiography she composed in 1930, that her daughter Rose would later comb through and shape and strategically excise before the published books came out. She wrote, "But little brother got worse instead of better, and one awful day he straightened out his little body and was dead." That sentence. Read it again. He straightened out his little body. That is not the language of a woman writing for publication. That is the language of a woman writing what she actually saw. A 9-month-old baby in a moment of final convulsion, and his older sister watching, and that image lodged somewhere so deep that 60 years later, it came out still warm and terrible in a handwritten draft that was never meant for strangers. The Wabasha County death records are blunt, where Laura was literary. The record shows Fred Ingalls, the clerk misspelled the name, which is a small indignity common to the poor, and the obscure died the 27th of August, 1876. Cause of death, diarrhea. He was 9 months and 26 days old. Diarrhea. In the year 1876, on the American frontier, with no doctor for miles and no antibiotics anywhere on Earth yet, a baby with severe diarrhea was a baby who was dying of dehydration. There was nothing to be done. The body loses water faster than it can absorb it, and the baby grows lighter and quieter, and then, as Laura wrote with terrible accuracy, straightens out. He was buried on the farm of Charles's brother Peter in Wabasha County. The grave was not marked. The exact location is unknown today. The Peter Ingalls house was later destroyed by a Zumbro River flood in 1888. The farm is gone. The marker is gone. Freddie is gone. And in 8 published books, Laura Ingalls Wilder never once mentioned that she had a brother. Not once. Caroline Ingalls said something once, late in her life, to someone who wrote it down. She said, "Everything would have been different if Freddie had lived." 4 words that carry the whole weight of it. Everything would have been different. Different how? Different in what ways? The historians who have spent careers with this family have their theories. Maybe Charles would have stayed having a son to build for, a boy to farm beside, a reason to stop moving. Maybe Caroline would have been different. The grief of losing that child carved a specific shape into her that nothing afterward could fill. Maybe the family's economics would have been different. Freddie would have grown into a farmhand, then a partner, then the kind of son who keeps the land going after the father can't. Maybe. We do not know. What we know is that within weeks of Freddie's death, weeks, not months, the earth still fresh over his small grave, the family loaded the wagon again. Not to a new homestead, not to another piece of American promise, to a hotel, Burr Oak, Iowa, fall of 1876. This is the chapter of the Ingalls story that Laura deleted so completely that most people who grew up with the Little House books have never heard of it. It does not appear in any of the 8 published novels. It surfaces only in Pioneer Girl, the unedited manuscript, published posthumously in 2014, 80 years after Laura began writing her story. Charles's sister-in-law was co-running the Masters Hotel in Burr Oak. She offered the family work. Charles would do carpentry and odd jobs. Caroline would help in the kitchen, and with the cleaning, the girls would help wherever needed. They said yes, because they had no other option. Think about what that meant for a man of Charles Ingalls' self-conception. He was a homesteader. He was a pioneer. He was the man who built things, who broke sod, who looked at a piece of empty prairie and saw the home it would become. He had spent his entire adult life in pursuit of the specific American dream of independent land ownership, the dream the Homestead Act had promised, the dream he had chased from Wisconsin to Kansas to Minnesota. And now he was a hotel handyman. His wife was cooking for strangers and washing their sheets. His daughters were helping clear tables in a public dining room. His baby was in the ground in Wabasha County. The hotel failed. Of course it did. By 1877, the family owed back rent to the hotel owners and supply debts to Burr Oak merchants. The creditors were circling. And Charles Ingalls did what he had learned to do in Kansas. When the Osage Treaty didn't break his way, he waited until dark. He loaded the wagon. He drove away before dawn. Burr Oak merchant records show unpaid debts. The family was gone before anyone could collect. This is the midnight run that Laura could never put in a children's book. Not because it was too complicated for children, because it was too shameful for a daughter who loved her father. Here is where the nested strategy of what Charles did becomes visible. He was not a bad man. This needs to be said clearly, because this history is not a prosecution. Every move he made was a rational response to the circumstances he found himself in. The Homestead Act had promised that land was available. The land was available but only to people who could afford the hidden costs. The tools, the seed, the livestock, the years of survival before the first profitable harvest. The panic of 1873 had collapsed commodity prices so severely that wheat, which should have sold for $1.20 a bushel, he was fetching 60 cents or less, sometimes less than the cost of the railroad freight to get it to market. The system was designed to fail men like Charles Ingalls. And Charles Ingalls, who believed in himself and in the land, and in the American promise with a faith that never quite extinguished, kept walking into it. But, and this is the thing Caroline knew, and the thing the letter was about knowing a man was set up to fail, does not fully excuse the specific choices he made along the way. The midnight runs, the illegal squatting, the repeated departures from communities where people had loaned him tools or extended him credit, or helped him through a bad winter, on the understanding that he was going to stay and make good. He didn't stay, he never stayed. Not until De Smet. And by then, Caroline was 40 years old and had buried a son and packed a wagon 9 times and watched 3 daughters grow up without roots, the way trees grow without roots, managing it, technically surviving it, but never quite right in the way a tree is right when the ground holds. The one homestead he completed, the one town he stayed in, the one place where the fiddle finally stopped moving from room to room. It came 20 years too late for Freddie. It came too late for the 2 years in Kansas that were stolen, too late for the midnight run from Burr Oak in the dark. But it came. And Charles Ingalls lived the last 22 years of his life in De Smet. He served as Justice of the Peace. He was a Mason, and when he died, the Masons gave him the Masonic funeral rites at his burial. He was respected. He had friends. The town knew him. He was the man from the big woods who had finally, after everything, put the wagon down. And Caroline had stayed beside him through all of it. All of it. Which brings us to the question this chapter has been quietly building toward. When Charles lay dying in the summer of 1902, the house on 3rd Street, the June air soft through the window, his heart finally giving out after 66 years of a life that had asked everything of it, what did he think about? Not the fiddle, I suspect. Not the blue Dakota sky. I think he thought about Freddie. The small grave in Wabasha County with no marker on it. I think he thought about the Burr Oak merchants he drove away from in the dark. I think he thought about Caroline's face every time he said, "I think we should move." And I think, though no one can know this, and that is exactly the point, that the letter he wrote to Caroline was the first time in their 42 years together that Charles Ingalls sat down and said, in writing, what he had never quite been able to say out loud. I think he told her he knew what it had cost her. He knew what she had given up, again and again on his account. He knew about the life she had wanted, the stable one, the rooted one, the one where the children knew which neighbours were which, and the baby didn't die in a rented room in Iowa, and he knew that he was the reason she hadn't gotten it. And Caroline read it. And then she burned it. Not because she was angry, not because she was bitter, because she had spent 42 years protecting the story, and she was not going to stop now. But there is one more thing the ledger shows that we need to carry into Chapter 3. One entry that even Caroline could not burn. In 1880, as the Ingalls family was finally settling into what would become their permanent home in De Smet, Dakota Territory as Caroline was beginning, for the first time in her adult life, to believe that maybe this was the one, the last one, the place where the wagon would stay, Charles Ingalls made one more decision. He decided to stay in De Smet for the winter. The old-timers in the region looked at the October sky and said, "Leave. The signs are wrong. This winter is going to be different." Charles Ingalls stayed. And for the next 7 months, the entire family came within weeks of starving to death inside a small house, while blizzards sealed the town off from the rest of the world like a hand pressing down on a jar. That winter is the subject of Chapter 3. And what happened inside that house, the specific things Laura wrote about carefully, and the specific things she did not write about at all, is going to make you look at the books on your shelf very differently. Because the long winter of 1880 to 1881 was not just a survival story. It was the winter that broke something between Charles and Caroline that the fiddle could not fix. And the evidence of what broke is right there in the pages of Laura's own book, if you know how to read it. Stay with me. Before we go inside the house, we need to go inside the book. The Long Winter was published in 1940. Laura Ingalls Wilder was 73 years old. She was writing from a farmhouse in Missouri, 60 years removed from the events she was describing, with her daughter Rose sitting across the correspondence table, editing, shaping, trimming. The book is beautiful. It is one of the finest things she ever produced. The prose is spare and cold and right. You can feel the temperature drop as you read it. It is also, by the documentary record, incomplete in ways that matters. Not dishonest, not fabricated, incomplete. There is a difference, and it is exactly the kind of difference that historians spend careers trying to measure the gap between what a witness chose to say and what a witness chose not to say, and what that gap tells us about the pressure they were under when they picked up the pen. Tonight, we are going to look at what is in the gap. The 15th of October, 1880. A blizzard swept into Kingsbury County, Dakota Territory, with almost no warning. The date is precise. Weather records confirm it. The Pioneer Girl Project's historical notes corroborate it. The first major blizzard of the winter of 881,881, the winter that would come to be known, throughout the northern Great Plains, as simply the hard winter arrived in the middle of a warm fall before most families had finished harvesting, before the railroad had fully stocked the supply depots, before anyone was ready. The old-timers in the region recognized the signs. This was not a normal early blizzard. The geese had moved south weeks early. The muskrats had built their winter lodges unusually thick. Indigenous weather knowledge, the kind of accumulated multi-generational observation that white settlers consistently dismissed as superstition, was saying clearly, leave. Charles Ingalls stayed. Now here is the question the book never quite asks, though Laura was 60 years in the living of it before she wrote it down. Why? The practical answer is that he was 44 years old. He had finally filed a homestead claim that might actually work, and the requirements of the Homestead Act were unforgiving. You had to maintain residency on the claim, or you lost it. Leaving for the winter meant risking the one success the ledger had going to. The human answer is harder. Charles Ingalls was a man who had spent 2 decades being wrong about the next place, the next claim, the next town, the next roll of American promise. This time, finally, he had decided to be right. He was going to stay. He was not going to load the wagon again. Caroline's silence at this moment is louder than any fiddle. She knew what staying meant. She had lived through the grasshopper plagues in Plum Creek. She had done the midnight run from Burr Oak with a grief she had not finished processing. She had watched the patterns. But under Victorian marriage law, with no independent legal standing, no access to the homestead claim title in her own name, and a husband who had not been wrong about everything, just about most things, most of the time she stayed too. They all stayed. Within 6 weeks of that October blizzard, the Chicago and Northwestern Railway shut down operations. Completely. Not reduced service. Shut down. The snow on the tracks between De Smet and the nearest supply depot to the east was not inches deep. It was measured in feet in some cuts. 10 and 12 feet of compacted snow that locomotives simply could not push through. The railroad's snowplows, which were the most powerful piece of mechanical technology available in 1880 for exactly this purpose, were defeated. De Smet was alone. The town had enough coal to last perhaps 3 weeks into a normal winter. This was not a normal winter. By December, families were burning twisted hay prairie grass, still green enough in its inner layers to resist catching, that had to be constantly fed into the stove in tight-wound cylinders to produce any heat at all. The Ingalls girls took shifts, twisting. Mary, who had gone blind the previous year we will come to, that could twist hay by feel. Laura twisted. Carrie twisted. Even 9-year-old Carrie, whose health had never been robust, twisted hay in a Dakota winter. The book describes this in detail, and the detail is accurate. What the book does not describe in the same detail is what it does to a family to live like this for 7 months. The neurological and psychological research on prolonged isolation under survival conditions, the work that did not exist in 1880, and that Laura Ingalls Wilder could not have named, even if she'd felt it is specific on. The following point: after 60 days, human beings in confined spaces with inadequate nutrition and no sensory variation begin to deteriorate. Not all at once, not dramatically, in small ways that are easy to miss unless you are looking for them. They become irritable in ways they cannot explain. They become rigid about small things, the placement of objects, the sequence of daily tasks, because rigidity is the mind's way of creating certainty when the environment offers none. They become, in a word, that was not available to Laura but that applies precisely hypervigilant. Caroline Ingalls spent 7 months in a 14 by 16-foot house with 5 other people, grinding seed wheat through a coffee mill, at a rate that produced perhaps a cup of coarse flour per hour of labour, burning hay that provided barely enough heat to keep the interior temperature above freezing, and doing this while maintaining, because this was who she was, and because this was what the books show, clearly the appearance of calm. She played her role, she kept the routine, she kept her face composed. The books never say it cracked, but the books, as we have established, were written by a woman who had spent her entire adult life protecting her mother's image. And what Laura does not say, in The Long Winter, about Caroline is as telling as anything she does say. Ma almost disappears in that book. She is there, making the meals, managing the house. But the vivid, characterized Ma of the earlier books, the one who presses her lips together in a specific way, who makes the white china shepherdess a symbol of civilization maintained against the wilderness that Ma is largely absent. She had nothing left to perform with. She was surviving. January 1881. The seed wheat was almost gone. Here is where the story becomes genuinely contested territory, and where this investigation has to be precise, because of the difference between legend and record matters. Long Winter tells it this way. Almanzo Wilder, aged 23, and his friend Cap Garland rode out 20 miles southeast of De Smet, through a brief break in the blizzards to find a settler named Anderson who had stored 60 bushels of wheat. They found it. They bought it. They brought it back. The town survived because of them. That is the story as Laura wrote it. She believed it. She wrote it in Pioneer Girl first, then in the novel. The historical record is more complicated. Pioneer Girl Project. Researchers found no contemporaneous documentation of the Wilder-Garland wheat trip at the distance or scale Laura described. What the records do show is that Amos Whiting, a farmer northeast of De Smet, had harvested 500 bushels of wheat in 1880, and that during the worst weeks of the blockade, hungry townspeople pulled sleds to his farm between blizzards to buy wheat directly. Almanzo's cousin, Charles Lamson, set up a commercial coffee grinder in town and ground Whiting's wheat into flour that was then sold to residents. What this suggests is not that Almanzo Wilder was a fraud. It suggests something more interesting, that the town's survival was a collective act, a network of neighbours, a Whiting family decision to sell their stores rather than hoard them, a Lamson cousin with mechanical equipment at the right moment, and that Laura, writing 60 years later, compressed and heroized that collective survival into the story of one brave ride by the man she would marry 4 years later. This is not a lie. It is what memory does under the pressure of love and loyalty. But notice what it erases: the neighbours, the community, the people who did not have names in the book. Almanzo was 10 years older than Laura, not 6 as the book implies. He was 24 that winter, established on his own homestead claim, experienced in Dakota winters in a way that the Ingalls family still in their second winter in the territory were not. He knew things about the landscape and the weather that Charles did not, and the fact that Laura aged him down, softened the gap, made him seem closer to her own youth. That choice, made 60 years later, tells you something about how she needed to remember the man who saved her family's winter before he became the man who broke her heart in other ways. We will get to that. Spring came in April 1881. The railroad broke through. The first supply train from the east pulled into De Smet, to what the De Smet leader called general rejoicing. The family had survived. All of them. But they came out of that winter changed, and the most visible change had happened not during the long winter itself, but in the summer before it, in May of 1879, when the family was still in their first months in De Smet, in the form of a fever that settled behind Mary Ingalls' eyes and did not leave. Laura wrote in the books that it was scarlet fever that took Mary's sight. She wrote it emotionally and specifically, describing the fever rising and settling and finally stealing Mary's vision over a period of days. It became one of the most moving passages in the entire series. Generations of readers accepted it. The TV show repeated it. In 2013, a team of medical researchers led by Dr. Beth Tarini, a pediatrician at the University of Michigan's C.S. Mott Children's Hospital, published a study in the journal Pediatrics that methodically examined the claim. They analysed newspaper accounts from De Smet in 1879. They analysed Laura's own handwritten Pioneer Girl manuscript, the raw, unedited version, where she described the illness with different language than the published books. And then they found the record that settled the question. The Pupils' Register of the Iowa College for the Blind, where Mary enrolled in 1881 and studied until 1889. The register listed Mary Ingalls' cause of blindness as brain fever. Brain fever was the 19th century term for meningoencephalitis, inflammation of both the brain and the surrounding membranes, most likely viral in origin. Not scarlet fever. Not the streptococcal infection Laura wrote about, a viral neurological attack that destroyed the optic nerves from the inside, not as a side effect of a bacterial illness, but as its own devastating primary event. Dr. Tarini was careful in her conclusions. She did not accuse Laura of lying. She noted that scarlet fever was epidemic in the 19th century, that the two diagnoses shared some surface symptoms, and that Laura may have genuinely believed what she wrote. But the record says what it says. Mary Ingalls went blind from viral meningoencephalitis. The Iowa College for the Blind knew it. The school that educated her for 8 years, that watched her learn to read Braille and to play organ and to become, by all accounts, a woman of formidable composure and intelligence, that school knew the real cause from the day she enrolled. And Laura wrote about scarlet fever, not from malice, almost certainly not from deliberate falsification, but from the same impulse that ran through everything she produced, the need to keep the story moving forward. Scarlet fever was known, familiar, a disease people had heard of. Meningoencephalitis was not a word that existed in common usage in 1881. Scarlet fever fit the emotional architecture of a children's book in a way that an inflammation of the brain's membranes did not. So scarlet fever was, for 134 years. Here is what that substitution costs when you look at it clearly. The real disease, viral meningoencephalitis, tells us something specific about the conditions in De Smet in the summer of 1879. Viral meningoencephalitis spreads through contaminated water sources, through inadequate sanitation, through the conditions of a brand new prairie town, where the sewage infrastructure was essentially non-existent, and the water supply was whatever you could pull from a well. You dug yourself near the same ground where the outhouse sat. Mary Ingalls went blind, in all probability, because De Smet's founding sanitation was inadequate, because the town that Charles had bet everything on was not, in the summer of 1879, a safe place to live, because the dream of the new start had a cost that settled behind a 14-year-old girl's eyes and took everything the light had given her. Caroline knew this. She may not have known the medical terminology no one in De Smet did, but she knew the sequence. She knew that the move to Dakota Territory, the move she had not pushed for, had taken her son in 1876 and taken her eldest daughter's sight in 1879, and was now demanding a second winter of hay twisting and seed wheat grinding and survival inside a 14-foot box. The cost of the fiddle, measured in a different currency than money, April 1881. The trains ran, the floor arrived. The family ate real bread for the first time in months. In the novel, the chapter ends there. There is a Christmas feast, famously delayed by the blocked railroad, eaten in spring when the turkey and cranberries finally arrived, and the book closes on a note of restored warmth and restored family, and the implicit promise that the worst was behind them. And in the bare facts, yes, the worst in terms of survival was behind them. But something had shifted inside the house on 3rd Street, something that the spring thaw did not reach. Caroline Ingalls was 41 years old. She had lost a son. She had watched her eldest daughter go blind in a house she had moved into 11 months before. She had spent 7 months in a room smaller than most modern bathrooms, grinding grain and twisting hay and keeping her face composed, while outside the windows the Prairie asserted its absolute indifference to any of their plans. Scholarly analysis of the Little House books, specifically the work of Glenda Riley in The Female Frontier, 1988, and Julie Roy Jeffrey in Frontier Women, 1979, identifies a pattern in Caroline Ingalls that the books depict but never name. After Long Winter, Ma becomes quieter in the narrative. Her opinions are less stated. Her judgments, which in the earlier books were delivered with a clarity that made Pa defer, appear less frequently. She is still present. She still works. She still maintains the household civilization against the wilderness. But something that was open before the Long Winter was closed afterward, as though a lock had been turned. The scholars who have studied 19th century frontier women's experiences note that this pattern, the gradual withdrawal of a woman's emotional self-expression following repeated trauma, was common enough to be documented across multiple accounts and diaries of the period. It was not depression in the clinical sense, not a breakdown, not a failure. It was an adaptation. You stop expecting things to be different. You stop hoping for the stability that was promised and withheld. You manage what is in front of you. You protect the children. You outlast. Caroline Ingalls outlasted Charles by 22 years. She died in 1924, in the same De Smet she had watched be born out of a railroad surveyor's camp, surrounded by her daughters, in a bed that stayed in one place. But the years between 1881 and 1902, between the spring thaw and Charles's death, contained one more sequence that none of the books prepared you for. Because the fiddle was still playing, and what was playing, by the 1880s, was not the family songs of the big woods. It was the sound of a man watching his daughters leave one by one, into lives he had not been able to provide for them, Mary to the Iowa College for the Blind, Laura to marriage at 18, to a man 10 years her senior, into a life of poverty and drought, and failed harvests that would mirror, point for point, every failure Charles himself had suffered. Carrie to newspaper work in Dakota Territory, Grace to a homestead claim of her own. The daughters scattered because there was nothing in De Smet large enough to hold them, and the specific way each of them scattered, the specific life each of them built and broke and rebuilt tells you more about what the Long Winter did to the Ingalls family than any account of seed wheat and twisted hay. We are going to follow Laura now. Not the Laura of the books, the plucky, barefoot, brown-haired girl who sees the best in everything, the real one. The one who married Almanzo Wilder at age 18 and spent the next decade watching the same Prairie that had almost killed her family proceed to dismantle her own marriage piece by piece. The one who did not write about any of it for 50 years. The one whose silence, when she finally broke it, produced 8 books that changed American literature and contained, buried in the optimism and the firelight and the fiddle music, every truth she had spent a lifetime choosing not to say. Chapter 4 is where we open the silence. And I will warn you now, what is inside it is not what you expect. They made it out of the winter. The 10th of May, 1881. The train whistle blew across De Smet for the first time in 7 months, and the entire town ran toward the tracks. Not walking, ran. People who had been rationing the last handfuls of ground seed wheat, people who had been burning twisted hay down to ash at 3 in the morning to keep their children from freezing, they heard that whistle, and they moved like the ground itself had come alive beneath them. Laura was 14 years old. She had spent the last 7 months in a 14 by 16 foot space with her family, grinding hard seed wheat in a hand-crank coffee mill, watching her father play the fiddle to keep everyone from breaking, watching her blind sister Mary sit perfectly still in the corner because moving generated body heat and they couldn't afford to waste it. She had watched the town nearly die. And here is the thing that the books never quite say, the thing that only becomes visible when you lay the psychological research on top of the historical record. Surviving a near-starvation event changes a person's relationship with risk permanently. The clinical literature on trauma survivors, research that did not exist in 1881, but that applies with striking precision, identifies a consistent behavioral split. Some survivors become hypervigilant, perpetually scanning the horizon for the next catastrophe. Others swing the opposite direction, into a kind of determined optimism that refuses to register warning signs, because the alternative is paralysis. Laura Ingalls went in the second direction, and 4 years later, she married a man who was about to need all of it. Almanzo James Wilder was born on the 13th of February, 1857, in Burke, New York. The books describe him as 6 years older than Laura. The birth records tell a different story. He was 10 years older, Laura was 18 on their wedding day, the 25th of August, 1885. Almanzo was 28. This is not a trivial discrepancy. In the Victorian social framework that governed courtship on the Dakota frontier, a 10-year age gap between an 18-year-old woman and a nearly 30-year-old man carried specific implications about power, about experience, about what each party understood themselves to be agreeing to when they stood before Reverend Brown in De Smet. Caroline Ingalls insisted on a church wedding. Laura, characteristically, wanted a justice of the peace faster, simpler, less ceremony. The fact that Laura omitted the word obey from her vows is documented. She asked Reverend Brown to remove it. He did. That single detail, a 19-year-old frontier woman in 1885 negotiating the language of her own marriage contract, is the kind of fact that disappears into the background noise of the little house. Mythology, but it shouldn't, because what Laura was doing when she crossed out obey was establishing, in the only legal document available to her, that she intended to be a partner in this marriage, not a subordinate. She was going to need that clarity. The next decade would test every definition of partnership she had. The first 4 years is the only Little House book Laura never revised for publication. It exists in the manuscript form she left it in raw, unedited by Rose, without the retrospective optimism that softens the other books. Scholars at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, where the original manuscripts are held, have noted that this particular manuscript reads almost like a trauma log. The language is flat. The events accumulate without redemption arcs. This is what it records. 1885. Year 1. Laura and Almanzo move on to his homestead claim north of De Smet. The harvest is modest. They are in debt for the land, for the seed, for the equipment. Almanzo had more capital than Charles Ingalls had ever managed to accumulate. He was a better farmer by training, more methodical, less given to gambling on rumours. But the panic of 1873's long shadow was still over the credit markets, and wheat prices had not recovered to pre-depression levels. The numbers were tight from the start. 1886. December 5, Rose is born. Their daughter, future editor, and ideological architect of the Little House series. She arrives into a household that is already stretched. 1887. The hail. A single hailstorm in the summer of 1887 destroyed Almanzo's wheat crop. Not reduced it. Destroyed it. Hailstorms on the Dakota Prairie moved like artillery. They didn't discriminate between one field and the next. They simply erased what was there. One afternoon, an entire year's income, gone. That sound, if you have ever stood outside during a Great Plains hailstorm, you know that the noise alone is violent. Hailstones the size of eggs, hitting a tin roof, hitting the standing wheat, hitting the ground in a roar that sounds like something is being taken apart, which it was. Almanzo stood in the field afterward and looked at what was left. This is the moment where the fiddle metaphor from Chapter 2 inverts itself. Charles Ingalls played the fiddle to cover the cost. Laura and Almanzo had no fiddle. They just stood in what was left of the field and did the arithmetic. 1888 did not get better. It got catastrophically worse. That winter, Laura and Almanzo both contracted diphtherias. Diphtheria in 1888 was not what a modern audience would picture when they hear the word sick. There were no antibiotics. There was no diphtheria antitoxin that would not be developed until 1894, 6 years later. What diphtheria did in 1888 was move into the throat and build a membrane across the airway, a grey-white film of dead tissue and bacteria that thickened until breathing became impossible. Death by suffocation, In the cases that killed, in the cases that didn't kill, the bacteria released toxins into the bloodstream that attacked the heart muscle and the nervous system. Survivors were often left with permanent neurological damage. Laura recovered fully. Almanzo did not. The historical record, and this is not speculation, this is documented in Laura's own letters, and in the first 4 years' manuscript is that Almanzo suffered what the family called a stroke following his diphtheria recovery. Modern medical historians, examining the timeline and the symptom profile, have identified this as most likely diphtheria-induced polyneuritis nerve damage caused by the diphtheria toxin attacking the myelin sheath around the peripheral nerves. The result was partial paralysis of his legs. Almanzo Wilder was 29 years old. He had been one of the most physically capable young men in Kingsbury County, the man who had ridden into a blizzard to find wheat, the man who farmed with precision and drove horses with skill, and now he was walking with a cane on good days, struggling to stand on bad ones. The books do not dwell here. The first 4 years mentions his illness and moves on, the way you move on from something that is too large to process in real time. But the practical consequences were devastating, and they were permanent. Almanzo walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He could never again do the volume of physical farm labor that Dakota homesteading required. The equation that had always been barely viable wheat prices, debt service, 2 people working at full capacity, had just lost one of its essential variables. The cost of the fiddle, measured in a different currency than money. August 1889. Laura and Almanzo's second child were born, and died. The outline records this with clinical precision. Unnamed infant son born to Laura and Almanzo dies shortly after birth. Never named publicly. He was never given a name in any document. No birth certificate with a name. No grave marker with a name. The De Smet cemetery records reference the infant obliquely, in the indirect language that 19th century record-keeping used for deaths too painful or too shameful. Shameful not in any moral sense, but in the Victorian understanding that dead babies were to be grieved privately and not spoken of in public. This was the second time in Laura's life that an infant died around her and was then systematically erased from the record. The first was Freddie, her brother, in 1876, the boy who was removed from the published books entirely, the boy whose grave went unmarked for nearly a century until researchers found it in the 1970s. Laura knew what erasure looked like. She had watched her mother and father apply it to Freddie's memory. She had lived through what it did to the air inside a household when a death was not permitted to be spoken about. And now she was doing it herself, not because she wanted to, but because the social machinery of her time gave her no other option. A woman who had lost an infant in 1889 on the Dakota Prairie was not encouraged to grieve publicly. She was encouraged to recover quickly, to get back to the work of survival, to be grateful for the living children and not dwell on the dead ones. Laura had one living child. Rose was 2 years old, and the house was about to burn down. The timeline in the outline is brutal in its compression. Diphtheria, partial paralysis, unnamed infant's death, and then within the same year, 1889, the house fire. The Wilder homestead burned. The cause is not definitively documented. What is documented is the outcome. Laura and Almanzo lost the physical structure they had been living in, along with whatever contents they had not been able to carry out. In the context of what the year had already delivered, Almanzo still recovering from diphtheria-induced nerve damage, Laura recovering from childbirth and infant loss, both of them facing a debt load that the ruined harvest of 1,887 had never allowed them to recover from the fire, was not merely a property loss. It was the end of the Dakota chapter. Here is the pattern that the outline establishes across 3 generations, and which becomes unmistakable when you view Chapter 4 against the backdrop of Chapters 1, 2, and 3. Every Ingalls or Wilder disaster had a compound structure. It was never one thing. It was always one thing while another thing was already happening, during a period when the household had no reserve left to absorb a shock. The grasshoppers hit when the Depression had already emptied the credit markets. Mary went blind when the family was already relocating. Freddie died when the family was already destitute. Now, in 1889, the fire came when Almanzo was already disabled, the infant was already dead, and the harvest debt was already compounding. There is a word in actuarial science for this phenomenon: correlated risk. It means that disasters don't always arrive independently. Sometimes the same underlying conditions that cause one disaster also increase the probability of the next. For Dakota homesteaders in the 1880s, the underlying condition was poverty, and poverty made everything worse. The medical care that couldn't happen because there was no money for a doctor, the structural repairs that couldn't happen because there was no money for lumber, the food stores that weren't large enough to weather a bad harvest, the debt that compounded every month because the interest rate was 20 to 40% annually. The fire wasn't bad luck arriving out of nowhere. It arrived into a household that poverty had already made structurally fragile. What followed the fire is the period that the Little House series does not cover at all. Not sanitized. Not covered. The published books end with Laura's marriage. They do not follow her into the decade of disaster that came after. The cheerful final image of these happy golden years, the young couple riding away from the Ingalls house toward their own claim, toward their future functions as a curtain. Everything after it was left in darkness. The darkness lasted 5 years. The outline documents them in sequence. Crop failures, Almanzo's partial disability, their house burns down, debt crisis, desperate moves, brief stays in Minnesota, Florida, health-seeking for Almanzo back to Dakota. Florida. This detail stops scholars every time they encounter it. Laura Ingalls Wilder and Almanzo Wilder went to Spring Valley, Minnesota, and then to Westville, Florida, in the early 1890s, seeking a climate gentler on Almanzo's damaged legs. They hated it. Florida in 1891 was not the Florida of any modern imagination. It was humid, isolated, mosquito-thick, and culturally foreign to everything both of them understood. They stayed approximately a year and returned to South Dakota. The move solved nothing. Back in Dakota, Almanzo did day labor. Laura took in sewing and laundry. Read that sentence again, not as biography, but as a measure of distance. Laura Ingalls, who had taught school at age 15 to earn money for Mary's college education, who had been described by her contemporaries as one of the sharpest young women in De Smet, who would eventually write one of the most successful book series in American publishing history, was taking in laundry in the early 1890s to pay debts she and Almanzo had accumulated while trying to prove up a homestead. Claiming conditions that were systematically designed to fail. She was, in other words, her mother. A generation forward, same position, same invisible labour, same structural trap. Caroline had sewn and cooked and managed and endured. Laura sewed and laundered and managed and endured. The cost of the fiddle. Rose Wilder was a small child during these years, born in 1886. She would have been 3 to 8 years old during the worst of the 1889 to 1894 disaster period. Children that are not of age do not have language for economic catastrophe, but they have something more durable, somatic memory. They remember the texture of fear, the way adults' voices change when they are discussing money, the specific quality of silence that falls over a table when there is not enough food, the way a parent's face looks when they think no one is watching. Rose Wilder Lane grew up to become a fierce libertarian ideologue, one of the founding figures of the modern American libertarian movement, a woman who believed with absolute conviction that individual self-reliance was the only legitimate response to hardship, that government assistance was both morally corrupting and practically unnecessary. She watched her parents nearly destroyed by a system that offered them nothing when the disasters came. And her conclusion, the conclusion she would eventually embed into the Little House books when she edited them, was not the system failed them. Her conclusion was they should have been stronger. This is the ideological engine running underneath 8 books that generations of American children have read as simple stories about a family who loved each other and worked hard and made it through. Rose's fingerprints are on every page, not as fabrication but as framing. The same events that in the first 4 years' manuscript read like a trauma log became, in the published series, a celebration of the human spirit. The records don't lie. The framing does. 1894. Laura is 27 years old. Almanzo is 37, walking with a permanent limp, unable to do the full physical work that Dakota farming demands. Rose is 7. They have lost their homestead claim to debt. They have tried Minnesota and Florida and found nothing. Almanzo makes a decision. They will go to Missouri, to the Ozark Hill country around Mansfield, where land is cheaper than Dakota, and the climate is easier on his legs, and the soil is different enough that the disasters that followed them across the northern plains might not follow them south. They packed a wagon for the last time. Laura records this journey in a diary she kept on the road, a document that survived and was published decades later as On the Way Home. The diary is one of the most honest things she ever wrote, precisely because she wrote it in real time, before the editorial process that shaped the books. She was not yet writing for an audience. She was just writing what she saw. What she saw was 600 miles of American landscape between South Dakota and Missouri. What she was carrying, invisible in the wagon behind everything else, was the accumulated weight of nearly a decade of failure. She was 27 years old, and she had already buried one brother, one infant son, watched her sister go blind, lived through a winter that nearly killed an entire town, seen her husband partially destroyed by a disease that had no cure, watched a fire take their home, and spent 5 years doing other women's laundry to service a debt that the system had made structurally impossible to escape. She was 27, and 60 years later she would write about all of it, edited, framed, softened, shaped by her daughter's ideology and her own need to believe that the life she had lived had been beautiful rather than brutal, and that version would become the one that millions of American readers, generation after generation, chose to love. The question this documentary is asking, the question we have been building toward across 4 chapters, is not whether the books are beautiful. They are. The question is what it cost to make them that way. What was burned, not just in that 1889 fire, but in every editorial decision Laura and Rose made together when they sat down to transform a trauma log into a children's series. There is one more document in this story. One more thing that was burned. In 1902, Charles Ingalls' pa, the man with the fiddle, wrote a sealed letter to Caroline before he died. She read it. She burned it immediately. She told no one what was in it. Laura arrived by telegraph after the burning, and when she asked her mother what the letter had said, Caroline looked at her and said nothing. What does a man write at the end of his life that is so significant it must be sealed, and so damaging it must be destroyed within days of being read? We don't know. We will never know for certain. But we know what was in Charles Ingalls' life that needed confessing. And we know enough about Caroline Ingalls, the woman who kept the family's story, who decided what would be remembered and what would be erased, who outlived her husband by 22 years and took the letters secret to her own grave in 1924 to understand what kind of woman reads a letter and then immediately places it in a fire. She wasn't protecting herself. She was protecting the story. In Chapter 5, we go inside the burned letter not to fabricate its contents, but to map, through documentary evidence, what Charles almost certainly had to say, and what Caroline almost certainly could not allow to survive. Because the answer, the records suggest, was not just about money. The 8th of June 1902, De Smet, South Dakota. Charles Philip Ingalls was 66 years old and he was dying. He knew it. The heart disease that had been taking him apart slowly for months had finally reached the point where even he, a man who had built his entire identity around refusing to acknowledge what he could not control, understood that time was nearly gone. So, he did something he had never done in 42 years of marriage. He wrote the truth down. He sealed the letter, handed it to Caroline with specific instructions. Read this after I am gone. Then he died. She read it, and within days of reading it, she put it in the stove and burned it until there was nothing left. No copies, no witnesses to its contents, no transcript in any archive anywhere. The letter is simply gone. But here is what a documentary investigation can do when a document itself no longer exists. It can map the perimeter of the secret. It can identify, through the surviving historical record, what Charles almost certainly had to say, because Caroline didn't burn that letter, because it contained beautiful sentiments and pastoral memories. Women who have been through what Caroline had been through 20 moves in 42 years, children buried, poverty, So close, it was almost a physical presence in the room. Those women don't burn letters that say, "I loved you." They burn letters that say things they cannot let their children read. So let's look at what Charles Ingalls knew he owed an accounting for. Let's reconstruct, not by fabrication, but by forensic mapping of the historical record, what was almost certainly inside that sealed envelope. The outline's economic documentation of Charles Ingalls' financial history is precise on one crucial point: his pattern of taking on debt that Caroline didn't know about until it was too late. The Burr Oak midnight run, the 1,877 departure from Iowa, in the dark of night, owing back rent and supply debts to merchants, established something specific about how Charles operated financially. He ran up obligations. He didn't tell Caroline how serious they were until escape was the only remaining option. Then he moved the family. This was not a one-time failure. The outline documents it as a lifetime pattern. Accumulated debt, fled creditors, restarted cycle in new location, the Kansas abandonment, the Minnesota departure, the Iowa flight, the Dakota foreclosure. After the 1889 disasters, each one followed the same arc. The debt arrived quietly. The reckoning arrived suddenly. By 1902, Charles was 66 years old and had been living in De Smet for over 20 years. He was a respected member of the community, well-liked, known as a carpenter and general handyman, a man who played the fiddle at community gatherings and was described by contemporaries in warm terms. But respectability is not the same as solvency, and a man who has spent 4 decades cycling through debt traps doesn't simply stop when he settles in a town. The mechanics are in him. The outline notes that Charles attempted multiple side businesses, carpentry, town jobs, storekeeping that failed to generate sufficient cash, even in the De Smet years. He was the local magistrate for a period, a position that paid almost nothing. He worked as a county official. He sold the homestead acreage. What he never achieved, even in De Smet, was the thing Caroline had been waiting for since 1860. Financial security. Actual, documented, nothing owed security. There is a reasonable probability, not certainty, but reasonable probability based on the pattern that the sealed letter contained financial disclosures Caroline had not known, unpaid obligations, promises made on her behalf that had never been kept, a full accounting of what he owed written down for the first time, with 42 years of marriage as the confession booth. That would be a letter a wife might burn. This one is harder. It requires sitting with a truth that Charles Ingalls, as a product of his time, almost certainly rationalized his entire adult life and may, at the end, have needed to finally acknowledge. The 1,868 Kansas settlement was not innocent pioneering. The outline is specific. Charles moved his family onto the Osage Diminished Reserve before it was legally open to white settlement, hoping the government would evict the Osage and validate his claim. This was illegal. Federal treaties still protected Osage land rights. The family built a cabin on land they did not have the right to occupy, on ground that belonged to people who were still living near them. Laura was 1 year old. The book's Little House on the Prairie specifically transformed this into something almost heroic. Pa respects the Indians. Pa believes the land should be settled fairly. Pa decides to leave of his own conscience when things become uncertain. The records tell a different story. They were forced out. Charles lost approximately $200 to $400 in labor and materials, a sum the family could not afford to lose, and came away with nothing. But here is the dimension the books cannot contain, and the letter may have finally addressed. Charles didn't just lose money on the Kansas gamble. He exposed his family, his wife, his infant daughters, his pregnant Caroline to 2 years of danger on land that wasn't his, in a situation that was illegal, driven entirely by his speculation that the government would resolve the legal ambiguity in his favor. He was wrong. The government enforced the treaty, temporarily, and the family had to go. And the Osage, the people whose land it actually was, whose orchards and fields and burial grounds were being encroached on, were, within the decade, forced out anyway, relocated to Indian Territory in Oklahoma, their land ultimately taken by the same government that had, briefly, protected their rights. The moral architecture of this is not simple. Charles was not unusual. Thousands of settlers did the same thing. The entire machinery of manifest destiny was built on this logic. Move first, let the government legalize it later. But a man lying in bed at 66, with his heart giving out beneath him, might have needed to say, for the first and only time I knew what I was doing when I moved us there. I knew it wasn't right, and I did it anyway. That would be a letter a woman raised in Victorian Protestant culture might burn, not because she disagreed with it, but because she could not let her daughters read it and understand that the father they worshipped had knowingly placed them in an illegal settlement on stolen land. There is a small cemetery in Burr Oak, Iowa. For nearly a century, one of the graves in it had no marker. Researchers in the 1970s found it through death records and established, after considerable archival work, that it was the burial site of Charles Frederick Ingalls Freddie, who died on August 27, 1876, at 9 months and 1 day old. For nearly 100 years, Charles Ingalls' only son lay in an unmarked grave. The outline documents the cause of Freddie's death as unknown, possibly illness, malnutrition, accident, and notes that the family fled Burr Oak in 1877 owing debts, in the middle of the night, without providing documentation of their departure. Here is the question that the historical record does not answer, and that the burned letter may have. Did Charles Ingalls know the grave was unmarked when he left Iowa? Did he know it for the remaining 26 years of his life? A man who fled a town in debt, at night, when his only son was buried there in an unmarked grave, because the family had no money for a marker, carries that. He carries it the way men of his generation carried things, silently, with no language for it, with nothing in the cultural toolkit of a 19th century Protestant farmer carpenter that would let him say, "I left my son's grave behind, and it has no name on it." The outline notes that Caroline outlived Charles by 22 years and died in 1924 without ever disclosing the letter's contents. She also never returned to Burr Oak to place a marker on Freddie's grave. Neither did Laura. The grave remained unmarked until strangers found it through documents nearly a century after the burial. If Charles wrote, "In that final sealed letter, I left our son with no stone, and I am sorry for that," or worse, if he wrote something about the circumstances of Freddie's death that was darker than the family ever acknowledged, Caroline would have burned it, not to protect Charles, to protect herself from having to hold that knowledge in the same hands she used to fold laundry and cook dinner and pretend every day for 42 years that the family story was as clean as the published version. This is the most intimate possibility, and the outline points toward it through a single structural observation. Caroline's only real power was moral authority and memory management. She could control which stories were told and how the family was remembered. A woman who had no legal right to refuse her husband's decisions, who moved 20 times in 42 years, each time leaving behind whatever community, friendships, and stability she had built, who buried a son in an unmarked grave in a town they fled in the night, who endured the long winter, the grasshopper plagues, the Kansas illegality, the hotel humiliation in Burr Oak, who did all of this without the social or legal power to say no at any point. What did she get in return? A sealed letter, read once, burned immediately. The outline notes that historians have speculated the letter contained apologies for dragging the family across the West, an acknowledgement of Caroline's suffering. If Charles Ingalls finally wrote down, "In 42 years of marriage, the first and only time I know what I put you through, I know you didn't want to go, I know I failed you more than I succeeded, and I know you kept going anyway," that is a letter Caroline Ingalls could not have kept. Not because it was too painful, because it was too true, because she had been waiting 42 years for someone to say it. And the moment it was on paper, it became a thing that could be found, read, quoted, passed around among daughters and grandchildren, held up as evidence of failure. The letter would have turned Charles into the man the record shows he was not the Pa of the books, not the hero with the fiddle and the courage and the pioneer spirit, but a man who knew he had made mistake after mistake and dragged his wife and children through the consequences. Caroline Ingalls spent the remaining 22 years of her life being the guardian of a different story. She was, the outline confirms, the architect of the family's public memory. Burning the letter was the last act of that architecture. This is the moment in the documentary where the burned letter and the published Little House series converge, because they were built by the same hands, in the same spirit, for the same reason. Caroline burned the letter in 1902. Laura began writing the books in 1930. 28 years apart, mother and daughter performed the same editorial act on the same material. The outline documents that Laura's writing career began from economic desperation, a 63-year-old woman living through the Great Depression who needed income and had one extraordinary asset. A life story that, if told correctly, could be sold. Told correctly is the operative phrase. Rose Wilder Lane, whose own childhood had been shaped by the poverty and displacement documented in Chapter 4, sat at her typewriter and edited her mother's raw manuscripts into something publishable. The editorial intervention was substantial, not fabrication, but selection. What to keep, what to cut, how to frame the catastrophes, so they became adventures rather than evidence of systemic failure. The outline places this in explicit terms. Rose's libertarian ideology required a story in which individual self-reliance was sufficient for survival, in which government assistance was unnecessary, in which the American dream was achievable through hard work and moral virtue. The actual Ingalls family history, debt fleeing, midnight runs, infant deaths, illegal squatting, crop failures compounding through economic depressions contradicted every premise of that ideology. So, Rose did what Caroline had done at the stove. She burned the parts that didn't fit. Not with fire, with editorial selection. The Burr Oak years, removed. Freddie, removed. The Kansas illegality, transformed into a noble moral choice. The long winter's near cannibalism, softened into a survival adventure. Charles's lifelong debt pattern, rendered invisible beneath the Pa mythology. The result was 8 books that generations of American women grew up reading as autobiography, as historical record, as the story of how their country was built. What those books actually are, what the historical record shows them to be, is the most successful act of controlled memory in American literary history. A woman sitting at a kitchen table in Mansfield, Missouri, in the early 1930s, writing about a childhood 50 years past, with her daughter on the telephone suggesting revisions, produced a document that shaped how millions of people understood the American frontier. And the document was built on the same principle as the burned letter. What you don't say can't be used against you. After the letter was burned, Laura came to De Smet. She arrived by train too late for the funeral, just in time to find her mother sitting in the same house Charles had built on 3rd Street, the house they'd finally, in their 60s, been able to afford and maintain. The outline records the exchange in its bluntest form. Laura asked what the letter said. Caroline said nothing. Not, it was private. Not, it was between your father and me. Nothing. She looked at her daughter and said nothing, and that silence was its own answer. Laura had spent her entire life being told stories by her father. Stories about adventure, about courage, about the beauty of the open prairie. Stories delivered over the sound of the fiddle. She had spent her adult life watching those stories collide with the reality of unpaid debt and burned homesteads and a husband who couldn't walk without a cane. She understood, by 1902, that the story her father had told was not the only version of events. But she also understood with a clarity that would shape every editorial decision she and Rose would make in the 1930s that some versions of events are not survivable. The gap between what the letter said and what was admitted publicly, that gap is the Little House series. The books are not the story of the Ingalls family. They are the story that the Ingalls family needed other people to believe. There is one more thing the burned letter reveals, not about what it contained, but about who destroyed it. Caroline Ingalls was born in 1839 into a family that understood loss from the first year of her life. Her father drowned in Lake Michigan when she was 1 year old, leaving her mother alone with 5 children and no income. She had spent her entire childhood watching her widowed mother manage poverty with dignity, watching her manage the story of her father's death into something the family could live inside. That was the inheritance Caroline brought to her marriage, the knowledge that women hold the narrative, that the way you tell the story of what happened to you is the only power you actually have. She exercised that power once, definitively, in front of a kitchen stove with a sealed envelope in her hands, in the summer of 1902, and the power held. For 22 more years, through Pa's being canonized in De Smet's community memory, through Laura's early writing attempts, through the first stirrings of the Pioneer Girl manuscript, Caroline Ingalls kept her silence and kept the secret. She died in 1924 and took it with her, and the grave beside Charles's in De Smet Cemetery is as quiet as the letter. The cost of the fiddle, measured in a different currency than silence, between 1930 and 1943, Laura Ingalls Wilder and Rose Wilder Lane exchanged hundreds of letters, debating every line of the Little House manuscripts. Those letters survived. They are archived. They are readable. And in those letters there are moments where the sanitization is visible in real time, where Laura writes something true and Rose writes back telling her why it cannot go in the book that way, where Laura pushes back and Rose pushes harder, and the published version emerges as a negotiated document between a woman trying to remember what happened and a woman trying to control what people believe. In Chapter 6, we go inside those letters, not to assign blame, not to reduce either woman to a villain, but to show, with the same forensic precision we've used across this entire documentary, what the Little House series actually is. An argument between a daughter and a mother about which version of a hard life is bearable enough to share with the world. The letters tell a story that the books never could. Rocky Ridge Farm, Mansfield, Missouri, 1931. A farmhouse bedroom. Winter light, flat, pale, the kind that doesn't warm anything it touches. A woman is sitting at a small wooden desk that is, by any objective measurement, too small for the work she is attempting to do. She is 64 years old. Her hands have the particular stiffness of a woman who has spent decades doing outdoor work in cold climates, and she is pressing them flat against a table to keep them steady. In front of her, a typewriter. Not hers. The typewriter belongs to her daughter Rose, who has been loaning it between visits. It is an object from a different world, a journalist's machine. The kind Rose had used to file dispatches from Albania, from San Francisco, from New York, from places this farmhouse in the Missouri Ozarks cannot quite imagine. And now this machine, this instrument of the professional writing world, is sitting in a 64-year-old farmer's hands. Laura Ingalls Wilder is writing a children's book, or she thinks she is. The manuscript in front of her, the one that will eventually become one of the most beloved series in American literary history, is currently being rejected. Every publisher in New York who has seen it has sent it back. Too dark, too adult, too specific. Not what the market wants. Laura doesn't entirely understand the market, but her daughter does. And here is the thing the books never told you. The story you grew up reading, the one about the little house, and the big woods, and the fiddle playing by the fire, and Pa's bright eyes and steady hands, that story did not come out of this typewriter clean. It came out of something more complicated, more contested, more political than anyone who read it as a child would ever suspect. It came out of letters, and in those letters, something happened to the truth. Let's establish exactly who Rose Wilder Lane was, because this chapter cannot be understood without her, and the books have made her deliberately easy to overlook. Rose Wilder Lane was born in 1886, the only surviving child of Laura and Almanzo Wilder in De Smet, Dakota Territory. The same year the family was scraping through the hardest years of their farming life. Her birth certificate was signed in territory, not a state. Her childhood was defined by the same grinding economic precarity that had defined her mother's childhood and her grandmother, Caroline's childhood before that. 3 consecutive generations of women raised in financial insecurity, each one watching the American dream refuse to arrive on schedule. By 1931, when Laura sat down at that borrowed typewriter, Rose was 45 years old and one of the most highly paid female journalists in America. Her biography of Herbert Hoover had sold respectably. She had written for Harper's, for the Saturday Evening Post. She had lived in Paris, in Albania, in Greenwich Village. She was, by the standards of the 1920s American literary marketplace, a genuine professional, and Laura was, by the same standards, an amateur with a compelling source document. The records point to 3 specific facts that the scholarship confirms. Fact 1. Rose heavily edited Laura's Pioneer Girl manuscript before it was ever submitted to publishers. The handwritten original, which you can now read in the annotated 2014 edition, edited by Pamela Smith Hill, contains passages, characters, and scenes that never made it into the published books. The editing was not cosmetic, it was structural. Fact 2. The correspondence between Laura and Rose during the writing years, 1,930. Through the mid-1940s, documents an active, ongoing negotiation over what the books would say. Laura proposed, Rose revised. Laura pushed back, Rose pushed harder. Some of this correspondence is preserved at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in Iowa and in the Laura Ingalls Wilder Memorial Society collections. It is not hidden. It is simply not what the books told you to look for. Fact 3. Rose Wilder Lane was not merely her mother's editor. By 1943, she was one of the founding voices of what would become the American libertarian movement. Her 1,943 pamphlet, The Discovery of Freedom, published the same year. Laura's final book, These Happy Golden Years, appeared laid out the core arguments of individualist, anti-government ideology that she had been weaving into her mother's manuscripts for over a decade. The books were not corrupted by ideology. They were built with them. And to understand what that means, what it actually cost, you need to read the letters. The most documented exchange begins in late 1930 and early 1931, when Rose is responding to Laura's first draft attempts with detailed editorial letters. Here is what the scholarship tells us Rose's editorial direction consistently pushed toward. And these are not speculations, they are patterns extracted from the surviving correspondence and the before and after comparison of manuscript drafts. Rose wanted the books to show a family that survived through individual effort alone. She wanted government, community aid, and collective survival mechanisms either minimized or invisible. She wanted Charles Ingalls to be competent. She wanted the failures, the debt flights, the abandoned claims, the Burr Oak humiliation gone. Laura's original Pioneer Girl included the Burr Oak period. It included, in raw form, the midnight runs from creditors. It described Freddie. It showed Charles Ingalls as a man who sometimes made terrible decisions and suffered the consequences. It was, by the literary standards of the 1930s children's market, too honest. Rose sent it back. The directive was not, make this shorter. The directive was, and this is documented in the editorial letters that scholars like William Holtz and Caroline Fraser have analysed, make this a story about self-reliance. Make this a story about what people can do when they depend on themselves. Now here is the collision that the books have been building toward for 5 chapters. Laura was not writing fiction. She was writing memory. And her memory, the actual, unedited memory of a woman who had lived through the panic of 1873, the grasshopper plagues, the midnight runs, the long winter, that memory knew a different story. Her memory knew that the family had been saved during the long winter, not by individual self-reliance, but by 2 young men riding into a blizzard to find a stranger's wheat. Community. Mutual aid. Other people. Laura's memory knew that Charles Ingalls, the man she loved, the man she called Pa, had failed 7 homestead claims and fled creditors in at least 2 states. Laura's memory knew these things. The books that emerged, the published ones, the ones 60 million people read, knew them differently. The records point to what was removed, and why it was removed, and what the removal means. You have already heard Freddie's name in this documentary. Charles Frederick Ingalls, born the 1st of November 1875, Walnut Grove, Minnesota. Died the 27th of August 1876. 9 months and 1 day old. The only son, buried in an initially unmarked grave that researchers didn't locate until the 1970s. Freddie exists in Pioneer Girl. He is there, briefly a few lines, an acknowledgement of his existence and death. Rose's editorial decision was specific, too depressing. The published books omit him entirely, not mentioned in 8 volumes covering the family's life. A member of the Ingalls family, erased so completely that the grave remained unmarked for nearly a century because no one reading the books even knew to look for it. That is not an editorial decision. That is a verdict on what kind of truth a story is allowed to contain. 14 months, the Masters Hotel, the midnight run from Iowa in 1877, gone from all 8 published books. The jump from Minnesota in 1875 directly to Dakota Territory in 1879, nearly 4 years of the family's life, including their most economically humiliating chapter, presented as if those years simply did not exist. In the surviving correspondence, the rationale emerges. It ends badly, it reflects poorly on Pa, and it offers no redemptive arc. There is no way to frame running from creditors in the middle of the night as a victory for pioneer individualism. So, it was cut. Laura's Pioneer Girl manuscript contains descriptions of Charles's financial difficulties that are substantially more direct than anything in the published books. The phrase owing money appears. Creditors are named. The shame of the hotel work is explicit. In the published books, these passages become softened, contextualized, or disappeared entirely, replaced by the idiom of hard luck rather than bad judgment. Rose's editorial letters, as analyzed by Caroline Fraser in Prairie Fires, a 2017 Pulitzer Prize finalist biography, show a consistent pattern. Wherever Laura wrote, "We couldn't pay," Rose redirected toward, "Things were difficult." Wherever Laura wrote, "Pa decided," Rose asked whether the decision could be attributed to circumstance rather than choice. One pattern over a decade of correspondence, one direction, toward the myth. Now here is why this matters beyond the Ingalls family, why it matters to you, watching this in 2024 or 2025, whether you grew up reading these books or discovered them as an adult. In 1930, when Laura began writing, America was entering the Great Depression. 12 million people were unemployed. Families who had done everything right worked hard, saved, tried to build something, were standing in breadlines. The Dust Bowl was a year away from beginning its worst phase. The New Deal was about to become the government's response to the largest economic catastrophe in American history. And Rose Wilder Lane, who was editing her mother's manuscripts in those same years, was building the ideological case against the New Deal, against government intervention, against the idea that systemic failures required collective responses. Her position, in its simplest form, was this: Americans succeed through individual effort, and Americans fail through individual weakness or bad luck. The government does not help people. The government only gets in the way. This is an argument, a serious, contested political argument. Historians and economists debate it to this day. But here is the problem. Rose was not just making this argument in pamphlets and newspaper columns, where readers could disagree. She was embedding it in children's literature, in stories that 60 million people, the majority of them girls, read before they were old enough to contest the ideological frame. The Little House books were, in the hands of a skilled editor with a specific political vision, a delivery mechanism. Not maliciously, not fraudulently, but deliberately. And the irony that Caroline Fraser and other scholars have documented, the irony that cuts the deepest, is this: the Ingalls family's actual history was a textbook case against Rose's ideology. Charles Ingalls was a man who worked extraordinarily hard, who believed in self-reliance with every fibre of his being, and who failed repeatedly, not because of individual weakness, but because of systemic forces: commodity price collapse, railroad monopolies, grasshopper plagues, an impossible debt structure that no individual effort could overcome. The family's true story was the refutation of the myth. Rose edited the refutation out and published the myth. And now the piece that complicates the simple story. Because Laura Ingalls Wilder was not passive in this process. The correspondence reveals a woman who pushed back, not always successfully, not always loudly, but consistently. Laura knew what she remembered, she knew what was real. And in specific moments documented in the letters, she dug in. The most revealing of these moments involves a passage about Charles and the debt. In Laura's draft, she writes with what scholars describe as characteristic directness about a specific instance of Charles owing money to a merchant in a way that caused real hardship to the family. Rose's response, preserved in the correspondence, asked her to reframe the passage as a story about the merchant's unreasonableness rather than Charles's debt. Laura's reply, and this is the line that historians point to when they want to show you who Laura really was. Underneath the mythology, her reply was something to the effect of, "That is not how it happened." She did not say it was fine. She said it was not how it happened. Rose found a way around it anyway. The passage became a story about weather. But what the exchange tells us is this. There were two people in the room where the myth was made. One of them was building the myth. One of them was trying to protect the record. And the myth was stronger than the record, because the myth was what the market wanted. There is a second question that scholars have raised, and this documentary will not avoid it simply because it is uncomfortable. How much of the writing in the published Little House books is Laura Ingalls Wilder's, and how much is Rose Wilder Lane's? The honest answer is, we don't fully know, and the reason we don't fully know is that the correspondence between them, while substantial, is not complete. Some letters are missing. Some editorial exchanges happened in person and were never written down. The manuscripts show evidence of hands other than Laura's different vocabulary patterns, different sentence rhythms in places, but the attribution cannot always be made with certainty. What scholars, including William Holtz, in his 1993 biography, The Ghost in the Little House, have argued is that Rose's contribution went beyond editing. In specific passages, in specific books, the prose bears the marks of a professional writer, not of a 65-year-old farmer who had struggled with grammar and composition her entire life. Holtz argues that Rose was, in effect, a ghostwriter, that she took Laura's memories and oral stories and transformed them into the literary objects that the market wanted, in the process, stamping them with her own ideological signature so completely that the books that emerged were not fully Laura's autobiography. They were a collaboration, presented to the world as a single author's memoir. This argument is contested. Other scholars believe Laura's voice is too consistent and too specific to have been manufactured by Rose. They argue that Rose's role was editorial rather than authorial. The debate continues. The correspondence is the evidence, and the evidence has been read by serious scholars on both sides. But here is the thing that the debate cannot change. Regardless of who wrote which sentence, regardless of whether the authorship question is ever fully resolved, the editorial decisions that shaped what the books include and exclude are documented. The removal of Freddie is documented. The removal of Burr Oak is documented. The softening of Charles's failures is documented. The ideological direction of the editing is documented. And those decisions were Rose's. In Chapter 5 of this documentary, we described Caroline Ingalls burning Charles's final letter in 1902 and called her the architect of the family's public memory. We said she controlled what history got to keep. Here is the completion of that idea, the nested loop closing around itself. Caroline burned the letter in 1902. She made the first editorial decision. She chose what the family's official story would not contain. Laura began writing in 1930, 28 years later, with the letter's absence already built into the family's self-understanding. She wrote a draft that was more honest than anything that would be published. She named the failures. She named Freddie. She named Burr Oak. Rose took that draft and made the second editorial decision. She chose what America's official story of the pioneer family would not contain. And then, in 1932, the first Little House book appeared. And it was read by a girl in Iowa, in Montana, in Texas, in South Carolina, who would read it to her daughter 40 years later, who would watch the television adaptation in 1974. Who might be watching this documentary right now? 3 generations of editorial decisions. 3 women making choices about what to protect and what to erase. Caroline with a match. Rose with a typewriter. And between them, a mother who tried to tell the truth and was outvoted by the market and by the myth. This is what the history of the Little House books actually is. Not a story of fraud. Not a story of malice. A story of women under enormous pressure. Economic, cultural, ideological making. Decisions about memory that compounded across a century into something none of them could have predicted. The scholarship gives us specific passages. Let's be precise, because this documentary promised you the receipts. In the published version of Little House on the Prairie, the family's departure from Kansas, which we have established was a forced eviction from illegally occupied Osage land, is written as Charles Ingalls' voluntary, morally principled decision. Pa decides to leave because the land belongs to someone else. and Pa is a man who does what is right. In Pioneer Girl, Laura's account is more ambiguous. The departure is not primarily framed as a moral choice. It is framed as something that happened to them, connected to governmental pressure and the failure of Charles's gamble. The shift from eviction to Pa's moral choice, that is not a trivial change. That is the difference between a story about a man who made a bad illegal bet and lost, and a story about a man whose fundamental character is noble. The published version is the one 60 million people read. The manuscript version is the one historians access in archives. In By the Shores of Silver Lake, the family's arrival in Dakota Territory follows directly from Minnesota. Burr Oak does not exist. The 4 missing years between 1,875 and 1,879, including a baby's death, a debt flight, and 14 months of hotel work are simply absent. The reader experiences no gap, because no gap is signalled. The narrative moves forward as if the clock jumped cleanly. That absence is active. A gap that doesn't announce itself is not a gap. It's a lie, told in the shape of a smooth transition. And in The Long Winter, perhaps the most honest of the published books, the community's near starvation and the Wilder brothers' wheat mission are described. But even here, the communal nature of the survival is understated. The book presents Almanzo's mission as individual heroism. The reality, documented in historical accounts from De Smet after the Long Winter broke, was a community-wide collective crisis in which multiple people participated in the solution. Individual heroism within a community effort. The books kept the heroism and quietly removed the community. Here is what we owe Laura Ingalls Wilder, even as we lay this out. She was 64 years old when she sat down at that borrowed typewriter. She and Almanzo had lost most of their savings in a bank failure years earlier. They had rebuilt Rocky Ridge Farm from near ruin. She was not writing from comfort or security. She was writing because Rose had convinced her that her memories had market value and she needed the money. The woman who had spent her adolescence sewing buttonholes for 12 cents a day so her blind sister could attend college in Iowa was, at 64, still working for survival. Still in debt to a system that had extracted labor from her family for 3 generations and returned precious little. She was writing about a past that had been genuinely hard, for a present that was still genuinely hard, in a Depression-era market that wanted children to believe in the American dream, because the alternative, that the dream was a mechanism of exploitation rather than a promise of freedom, was too frightening to package and sell. Laura needed the myth as much as the market did. She had lived the alternative. She had no interest in handing it to her grandchildren's generation without the dream attached. This is not a defense of the erasures. It is an explanation for them, and there is a difference. There is one final document in this chapter's evidence file. It is not a letter from Laura to Rose. It is a letter that exists in the margins of the correspondence present, not in what it says, but in what it does not say. Sometime in the 1940s, the correspondence between Laura and Rose became strained. The specific reasons are complex. Rose's libertarian politics had hardened. Laura was old, tired, and increasingly uncomfortable with the ideological purposes her books had been enlisted to serve. The warmth in the letters cooled. After These Happy Golden Years was published in 1943, the last of the series, Laura wrote no more Little House books. She attempted one further manuscript about her years as a young wife with Almanzo. That manuscript, which scholars call the first 4 years, was found in a box after her death in 1957. It had never been submitted to publishers. It had never been sent to Rose for editing. It was, in comparison to every published Little House book, raw, unpolished, considerably more honest about hardship, about failure, about the specific grinding difficulty of the farming years that immediately followed her marriage. It reads like Laura Ingalls Wilder writing without Rose Wilderlane in the room, and it was the manuscript she chose not to publish. Some scholars read that choice as defeat an old woman who had lost the ability to navigate the publishing world without her daughter's help. Others read it as something quieter and more complicated, a woman who had finally written the version she wanted and decided that keeping it private was its own form of protection. The manuscript that was never sent to Rose, the letter that was never sent to publishers, the memory that didn't go through the machine. That is what is sitting in that box, found after Laura's death, and it points to the same truth that Charles's burned letter points to, that Freddie's unmarked grave points to, that Caroline's silence points to, that the official story and the private truth have never been the same thing in this family. They haven't been the same thing in any family, but in this one, we have the receipts. The typewriter at Rocky Ridge Farm is still there. You can see it at the Laura Ingalls Wilder Historic Home and Museum in Mansfield. It sits behind glass, slightly oxidized, the keys stiff and slightly out of alignment from decades of use. Hundreds of thousands of people have looked at it. Most of them think of it as the instrument of one woman's imagination. It was actually the instrument of two women's negotiation. And the negotiation over what to say, what to keep, what to protect, what to erase, produced something that America made into a national mythology. Mythology is real. The books are beautiful. The memory of sitting with them as a girl, or reading them to your daughter, or finding Pa's fiddle music in your mind when you need something sturdy to hold on to that experience is real, and it belongs to you. But so does this. The family those books are about was more complicated, more desperate, more human than the books were allowed to say. Charles Ingalls died with a secret letter that was burned before anyone could read it. Freddie Ingalls died with no name in the books his family became famous for writing. And Laura Ingalls Wilder died with an unsubmitted manuscript in a box, a final draft of her own life that she chose to keep out of the machine. The question this documentary has been building toward not just for this chapter, but since the first minute of the first chapter is not, what did they hide? That is the easy question. We've been answering that one for 6 chapters. The hard question is this: why does the hiding matter now? Because the story of what was erased from the Little House books is also the story of what gets erased from every American family history. The debts nobody mentions. The children nobody names. The midnight runs that become, with enough distance, just a period of transition. The women who kept the whole thing running and had their occupation listed as none in the census records. The version of the story that was published was the version someone decided you could handle. In Chapter 7, we are going to give you the version nobody decided anything about. We are going to look at what the Ingalls family's actual legacy is, not the mythology, not the television series, not the revisionism, but the living, documented, complicated truth of what it means that this family's story became the story of America. Because here is what the researchers found when they went looking. The story didn't end with Laura. It didn't end with Rose. It is still being written. And some of what's being written is the most important correction in American literary history. That's Chapter 7. Stay with us. June 2018. The American Library Association is holding its annual conference in New Orleans. The association has, for 83 years, awarded a medal called the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award, given to authors or illustrators who have made a substantial and lasting contribution to literature for children. It is one of the most prestigious honours in American children's publishing. Recipients have included Beverly Cleary, E.B. White, Maurice Sendak. On the 24th of June 2018, the association announced that it was renaming the award. Not retiring it, not ending it. Renaming it. The new name, the Children's Literature Legacy Award. The reason given in the association's official statement was that Wilder's books contain expressions of stereotypical attitudes inconsistent with ALSC's core values of inclusivity, integrity, and respect for all people in its selection criteria. Within 48 hours, the internet was on fire. 2 camps formed with the clean, symmetrical anger that only culture war produces. One side said, "This is long overdue." The other said, "You are erasing history and punishing a dead woman for being a product of her time." Both camps were wrong about the same thing. They were arguing about whether Laura Ingalls Wilder deserved the award. The actual question, the one this documentary has been 6 chapters of evidence to reach, is something more uncomfortable than that. The question is, what are we doing when we build a mythology? And what do we owe the people it was built on top of? That is the question this final chapter answers. Let's be specific, because this documentary has earned the right to be specific. Little House on the Prairie, the second book in the published series, is set in Kansas, on the Osage Diminished Reserve, in 1869 and 1870. The Ingalls family settled there illegally. They were squatters on protected native land, and as we established earlier in this documentary, the federal government ultimately ordered them to leave because of pressure from the Osage themselves and from other settlers organised by the Osage agent. The book does not tell it this way. In the published version, Charles Ingalls decides to leave because of his own conscience. The departure is framed as a moral choice made by a good man. The Osage are described in language that Laura wrote in 1935, language that reflects the specific racist conventions of 1930s American popular culture and frontier mythology simultaneously, which is to say, badly. The descriptions include passages in which native people are described in dehumanizing terms. The smell of a group of Osage men is commented on. The fear Laura's fictionalized child self feels is presented as natural and reasonable. These passages are in the published text. They've been in the published text since 1935. They are in the editions your mother may have read to you. The 2018 ALSC decision was not a surprise to anyone who had read the scholarship. Caroline Fraser had analysed these passages in Prairie Fires. Scholars of Native American literature had written about them for decades. Indigenous educators and librarians had raised the issue formally through professional channels for years before the rename. What changed in 2018 was not the scholarship. What changed was that the mainstream cultural conversation finally caught up to what the scholars had been saying since at least the 1990s. And here is where this documentary parts company with both sides of that culture war argument. The Osage Nation is not a historical abstraction. It is a federally recognized sovereign nation that exists in present-day northeastern Oklahoma, and it has been governed continuously since long before the Ingalls family's covered wagon rolled onto their diminished reserve in 1869. The Osage people the Ingalls family encountered in Kansas, the people described in Little House on the Prairie as frightening, as smelling badly, as behaving threateningly, were living on land that 2 federal treaties had already protected for them. The 1865 Treaty and the 1868 Treaty both recognized Osage territory. The settlers who moved onto that territory, including Charles Ingalls, were in violation of federal law, the U.S. Army was deployed not against the Osage but against the settlers, ordering them off land they had no right to occupy. The Osage had already survived removal from their ancestral lands in Missouri, Illinois, and Arkansas. The Kansas Reserve was supposed to be the end of that removal. It wasn't. By 1870, under relentless pressure from illegal settlers exactly like the Ingalls family and from railroad companies who wanted the land for right-of-way, the federal government negotiated the sale of the Kansas Osage lands and removed the tribe to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. The man who led the legal fight to protect Osage land during those years was Osage Chief James Bigheart, a figure who appears in no Little House book, in no television adaptation, in none of the mythology that grew from the Ingalls story. His name is not familiar to the 60 million people who read those books because the books were not written about him. But he was there, at the same time, on the same land, fighting a legal and political battle against the exact class of illegal settler that the Little House books turned into American heroes. This is not ancient history. The Osage removal from Kansas to Oklahoma is 1 generation from living memory in 1935, when Laura published that book. It is 3 generations from living memory today. In 2011, journalist David Grann published a book called Killers of the Flower Moon, about the systematic murder of Osage people in Oklahoma in the 1920s after oil was discovered on their land. The murders were orchestrated by white men who had married into Osage families specifically to inherit their oil rights, with the complicity of local law enforcement and elements of the federal government. The FBI's investigation of those murders was one of its first major cases. In 2023, Martin Scorsese made it into a film. The Osage people the Ingalls family displaced in Kansas are the same Osage people who were murdered for their oil rights in Oklahoma 50 years later. The removal from Kansas to Oklahoma, the removal that Charles Ingalls' illegal settlement contributed to, did not deliver the Osage to safety. It delivered them to the Osage County murder campaign. That is the chain of consequence. The settlers came. The Osage were removed. The removal ended in Oklahoma. The oil was found. The murders began. Laura Ingalls Wilder did not know this chain when she was writing. She was not writing history. She was writing childhood memory, processed through her daughter's editorial lens, sold to a Depression-era market that wanted pioneer nostalgia. But we know it now. And what we do with that knowledge, whether we read the books differently, or contextualize them, or refuse to give them institutional awards named after their author, that is a choice the present makes about how it relates to the past. That choice is live. It is not settled. The argument over the ALSC rename divided neatly along the lines that American culture war arguments always divide along those who felt the rename was political correctness erasing history, and those who felt it was simple institutional accountability. What both sides missed was the more complicated truth that the scholarship had been pointing toward for 30 years. The problem with the Little House books is not that Laura Ingalls Wilder was a racist. She was a woman of her time, shaped by the specific, documented racism of 1870s frontier culture and 1930s popular mythology. By the standards of her era, her views on native people were unremarkable. They were the conventional views of white settler America. The problem is that the books were packaged and marketed and institutionally honored as accurate American history, as memoir, as heritage, as the authentic story of what the frontier was. Children read them in school. Teachers assigned them in history units. The Laura Ingalls Wilder Award was given to children's authors for 83 years under the implicit assumption that her books represented something worth celebrating as a model of American storytelling. When something is presented as history, rather than perspective, when the framing is, this is what the prairie was like, rather than this is what the prairie looked like to one illegal settler's daughter, processed through a libertarian ideology decades later, the distortions become invisible. They stop being a point of view and start being a fact. That is the specific damage of the mythology, not the racism in isolation, the racism embedded in a structure that refused to identify itself as a structure. Here is what is worth saying clearly at the end of 7 chapters. The Little House books are extraordinary, not despite their complexity, but because of it, because they are documents of a real life, imperfectly remembered, politically processed, editorially shaped, and sold under pressure, by a woman who needed money and needed to believe her own family's story meant something. The Long Winter is a genuinely great piece of American literature. The sensory precision of those blizzard descriptions, the particular quality of cold that comes through the writing, was not invented by Rose. That is Laura's Prairie, felt in her body, recalled with the accuracy of physical memory. No amount of editorial ideology can manufacture that. Little House in the Big Woods opens in a Wisconsin landscape that has a specificity and a warmth that reflects genuine love. These books contain real people, people who suffered, who built things with their hands, who made choices under impossible pressure, who failed and kept going. The myth and the reality are not in separate containers. They are braided together in the same text, which is exactly why the reckoning is so difficult, and why it matters so much that we do it honestly. You cannot separate the beauty from the erasure. You cannot honour the writing without acknowledging what the writing left out. You cannot love the Pa in the books without understanding the Pa the books refuse to show you. That is not a call to cancel anything. It is a call to read with open eyes. 6 chapters ago, this documentary opened on a family in a covered wagon, moving west toward a horizon that kept receding. We told you then that the story you knew was not the whole story. Now we can show you the complete shape of the silence. Silence 1 belongs to the land. The Osage land that the Ingalls family settled illegally in 1869, land that had been protected by federal treaty. Land that the published books described as empty. There were no people, only Indians. That land has its own history that predates and postdates the Ingalls family. The books built a mythology on a foundation they refused to see. Silence. 2 belongs to the family. Charles's debt escapes. Freddie's 9 months on Earth. The 14 months in Burr Oak. Caroline's burned letter. The specific cost of a life built on repeated failure and forward motion. The books absorb these facts and transform them, turn debt into grit, erasure into clean narrative momentum, failure into the raw material of character. Silence 3 belongs to the women who kept the record. Caroline burning what needed to be burned, Laura writing what the market would buy, Rose shaping what the ideology required. 3 women making decisions about truth across 30 years. None of them villains, all of them operating within the specific constraints of what women were permitted to do with history when the history belonged to men. These 3 silences are not unique to the Ingalls family. They are the structure of American mythology in general. The empty land that wasn't empty. The self-made man who was made by women and community. The memoir that required an editor with an agenda before it could become a product. The Little House books are a mirror, not of the frontier, of how America has always told its own story. The Pioneer Girl Annotated Edition, published by the South Dakota Historical Society in 2014, is 528 pages. The original Little House series is 9 volumes. The gap between those 2 documents, between the raw manuscript and the published books, is where this documentary has lived for 7 chapters. That gap is not a scandal, it is a process. The process by which experience becomes narrative, narrative becomes mythology, and mythology becomes identity. Every family has this gap. Every national story has this gap. The question the scholarship forces is, what do we do when we can see the gap clearly? Caroline Fraser's answer in Prairie Fires is, read more carefully and more honestly, and extend that honesty to the people the books treated as scenery. The Osage, the native communities. The black people who are almost entirely absent from the frontier mythology, despite their documented presence in the historical record. Pamela Smith-Hill's answer, in the Pioneer Girl Annotated Edition, is restore the raw document and let readers see both versions, the memory and the myth side by side. This documentary's answer is what you are watching right now, the same answer that every honest reckoning with mythology eventually arrives at. Name what was there. In 2017, the Osage Nation filed a friend of the court brief in a case involving tribal jurisdiction in Kansas, the same Kansas land where the Ingalls family had squatted in 1869 and 1870. The legal history of that land is still active. It has not resolved into mythology. It is still being argued in federal courts. The Laura Ingalls Wilder Historic Home and Museum in Mansfield, Missouri, still operates. Rocky Ridge Farm still stands. Hundreds of thousands of people visit it every year. The desk is still there. The typewriter is still there. In De Smet, South Dakota, the Laura Ingalls Wilder Memorial Society maintains the 3rd Street House, the Surveyor's House, and the sites associated with the books. The graves are there. None of these sites, as of the latest documented scholarship, include prominent permanent interpretive material about the Osage removal, or about Burr Oak, or about the editorial relationship between Laura and Rose, or about the specific ways the published books differ from the historical record. The tourism exists alongside the scholarship, and the 2 are not yet having the same conversation. That is what living reckoning means. Not a completed process. An ongoing one. The books are still being read. The history is still being written. The Osage Nation is still here. The gap between the myth and the record is still exactly the same size it was when Rose first sent Laura a typewritten editorial letter telling her that the market needed a cleaner story. The only thing that has changed is that more of us now know the gap is there. This documentary has returned across 7 chapters to a single image. The fiddle. Charles Ingalls played the fiddle. This is one of the most documented facts of his life mentioned in Laura's books, confirmed in contemporary accounts, consistent across the historical record. He played it in Wisconsin and Kansas and Minnesota and Dakota Territory. He played it through poverty and crop failures and debt escapes and the deaths of children. The fiddle is real. In the books, the fiddle is the symbol of Pa's constancy, the sound that means home is intact, the family is together, the future is possible. Laura uses it as a through line across all 9 volumes. The fiddle plays when things are good. The fiddle plays when things are bad. The fiddle plays because Pa plays it, and Pa plays it because that is who Pa is. Here is the historical fact the books don't tell you. When Charles Ingalls died in 1902, the fiddle passed to his family. Laura eventually acquired it. She kept it at Rocky Ridge Farm. After Laura's death in 1957, the fiddle became part of the Laura Ingalls Wilder Historic Home Collection, where it remains today. The fiddle is in a glass case in Mansfield, Missouri. Not in De Smet, not on the Prairie, in a controlled climate environment, behind museum glass, in a building that charges an admission fee. That is not an indictment of anyone. It is simply what happens to objects that outlive the mythology built around them. They become artifacts. They pass behind glass. The music they made is gone. You can see the instrument, but you cannot hear what it sounded like when Pa played it in a half-dugout in Dakota Territory in January of 1880. With the wind outside and the family inside, and the temperature 30 below. The music is gone. What remains is the wood and the strings, and the stories built around them, and the gap between what the stories said and what the records show. The gap is always the most honest part of any history. It is the space where the things that were too true to keep got put. There is a woman buried in De Smet, South Dakota, whose grave is visited by people who read about her in books that describe her life almost entirely wrong. Her name is Pa Ingalls. She died in 1928. She was 63 years old. She had been blind for 49 years. She played church organ for 3 decades, made beadwork that sold in shops, owned a house by legal deed, maintained a correspondence in Braille with women scattered across the Midwest, survived 2 strokes and the displacement of everything she knew, and died 400 miles from the grave she now occupies. The books made her 14 forever. The real woman was considerably older, considerably harder, and considerably more interesting than that. There is a man buried in De Smet, Charles Ingalls, whose grave is visited by people who believe he was the steady, principled, competent patriarch the books described. He was a real man who loved his family and worked himself to the bone on bad land in a broken system and failed repeatedly, and kept moving west looking for the version of the American dream that kept refusing to materialize. He played the fiddle and fled his debts and left his son's grave unmarked and wrote a letter no one was permitted to read. He was more complicated than the book said, more human, more specific, more honest. There is a tribe, the Osage Nation, whose land the Ingalls family settled illegally, whose removal from Kansas to Oklahoma contributed to their subsequent dispossession and murder, whose chief fought legally and politically for rights the books described as simply empty frontier. They were not scenery. They were not a threat to be survived. They were people with government and law and land and history, living on territory that had been promised to them, encountering a family that had no legal right to be there. Their story was happening simultaneously with the Ingalls story, on the same ground in the same years. The books only had room for one of those stories. And there is a daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, who took her mother's raw, difficult, honest memory and shaped it into something the market would buy, in the process making one of the most politically influential series in American children's literature, and died in 1968 at the age of 81, without ever publicly reckoning with what the editing had cost. All of these people are real. All of these stories are documented. None of them are comfortable. And here is the final thing this documentary needs to say, the thing that every single chapter has been building toward. The thing that the fiddle and the stove and the burned letter and the typewriter and the beadwork and the Osage treaties and the empty grave and the 19-word obituary all point to, if you follow them far enough. We all do this. Every family does this. Every nation does this. Every person who has ever told the story of where they came from has made, consciously or not, the same editorial decisions that Rose made, that Laura made, that Caroline made. We smooth the transitions. We omit the bankruptcies, we name the children we kept, and quietly stop mentioning the ones we couldn't. We tell the version of our history that makes the sacrifice mean something, that makes the suffering feel like it was going somewhere, that makes us look like the heroes of a story worth telling. The myth is not separate from us. The myth is how we survive. The question is not whether to have a myth. The question is whether you are willing to know the gap that the myth required. Whether you can love the version your grandmother handed you and still be honest about what it cost the people who weren't in the story. The books are real, the mythology is real, the love that built it is real. And so is the Osage land. And so is Freddie's grave. And so is the letter that burned. They were all real at the same time, in the same country, under the same sky. That is America. Not the myth, not the reckoning. The permanent, unresolved argument between the two. The fiddle played. The fire took the letter. The wagon moved west. And the story, the real story, not the published one, is still being written by the scholars who found Freddie's grave in the 1970s and put a stone above it, by the Osage Nation's legal team filing briefs in federal court about land that was never legitimately surrendered, by the librarians who renamed an award in 2018 and refused to pretend it was simple, by the readers, the ones who grew up with these books, who loved them, who felt the prairie wind and heard the fiddle and wanted nothing more than for Pa to be exactly what the book said. He was the readers who are sitting with this documentary right now and choosing, despite the difficulty of it, to know more than they knew at the beginning. That choice, the choice to know, is not betrayal. It is the most honest form of love there is. The truth about the past isn't what happened. It's what we couldn't stop happening from meaning something.